Welcome to the BCI's webinar on lessons learned from supply chain disruption. To start with, each speaker will introduce themselves and present a short presentation. After this, we'll move on to a general discussion looking at some key topics on this subject. I'll hand it over to the first speaker just to introduce themselves now.
Okay, thank you very much, and hello everyone. So good morning, good afternoon. My name is Zera, responsible for business resilience in Maersk Lee Logistics. I'm based in The Hague, Netherlands. Very pleased to be here and talk about resilience. In the next, I would like to share two real-life cases on how Maersk manage disruptions. Maersk is an integrated transport service suppliers on ocean. Maersk move 20% of global containers, and also Maersk provides air, rail, warehousing, and distribution services. Maersk globally also serve more than 100,000 customers across 130 countries. To many of Maersk customers, actually, so Maersk is one of their largest service suppliers. And also, that's one of the reasons that why we in Maersk see resilience is so critical and important, not just to us, but also to our customers. In the past few years, actually, Maersk experienced cyber attacks, global pandemics, extreme weather, civil unrest, and etc. Running business in multiple countries and locations. We harvest not only the experience, but also the lessons learned. So the first case I would like to share here is the Suez Canal blockage incident. Could you please move to the next slide? Thank you. And also one more click, sorry. Yeah, thank you. Actually, I think that you, most of you probably already heard a lot about what's happened there. The evergreen container ship that has been waged in the Suez Canal blocked the Suez Canal for 6 days. And this 6-day blockage actually brought a huge disruptions to the supply chain globally, because it impacted about 12% of global trading, and more than 300 vessels were stuck there in these 6 days. Could you please move to the next slide? Thank you. When we handle this Suez Canal in Maersk, we actually focus on 3 areas. The first is about visibility. When an incident happened, the first things that our customers want to know is always how many of their cargoes be impacted. Well, for the normal situations, usually that only impacts one locations. The amount of the impact cargo usually a fixed number. But very special for the Suez Canal cases here is actually every day there's additional 50 to 80 vessels added into the queuing in Suez Canal, and also some of their vessels decided to reroute around the Cape, and also so basically the number of the impact vessels actually keeping changing every day. That also means the impact of cargoes, the shipments are also changing all the time. So to provide the better visibility to our customers about the impact to their shipments, we actually connected with our vessel fleet team to get the real-time vessel status, and also based on that information, we can further track and provide the better visibility to our customer about their impact cargoes. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, once the customers knows about how many cargoes being impacted, then they usually they will come up with a further questions. So what are we gonna do? How we can mitigate the impacts? So very important that we also need to provide them the alternative solution. So what we did is we engaged our different departments, especially the different product team and also the commercial team, to analyze the general impact to Maersk services, and also we co-developed their alternative solutions together. When the Suez Canal was blocked at the beginnings, no one knows that how long the impact will last, right? So at that time, we actually worked out in the 2 scenarios, the likely scenario and also the worst scenarios. In the worst scenarios, that means the blockade will continue, and also means all the vessels finally have to reroute around the Cape, which also means for example, so for Asian to European trade lanes, that's additional at least 10 days, and 22 days for the Middle East to Mediterranean trade lane. So that's the impact to our customers. So what we did is we actually prepared the alternative options to our customers, especially these customers who are sensitive to the lead time. We provide them some alternative solutions, such as the intercontinental rail services, or using or sea air services that are using our hubs in Middle East to help them mitigate the general impacts, and also to still keep the lead time target. That's about the alternatives. And the third thing is about the communications. So apart from these timely and frequently updates on Maersk website, we also engage with our commercials and also customer service team to jointly collect the customer feedback and also the frequent asked questions. Our communication team also analyze what the topics that the customers are interested about, what the questions that they ask most frequently, and then try to make sure these questions, these topic can be covered in the next customer anniversary as far as possible. So that's also why if you go to the Maersk website, if you search Suez Canal news, you will see that on top of these normal vessel or shipment updates, you will also find some videos on Maersk website explaining how Maersk made the decisions on diverting some vessels around the Cape. This is because the customer is interested about this. So as a result of these crisis handling, we received quite a few customers' recognitions, and some customers commented that the way of our communications and the disruption handling, even though they shared internally as a good examples with their team. I think in general, this is a good indicators of customer trust, or it's increasing the customer trust. And also, this is also shows the value of resilience. Next slide, please. The second cases that I would like to share is Myanmar civil unrest. So this is this is actually about how Maersk, as a logistic suppliers, to support the customer and mitigate the risk and also the impact to their supply chain. A brief background about what happens in Myanmar. Actually, on February 1st, Myanmar military arrested their key elected officials and seized the control of the government. This aroused the resistance from the peoples and also the massive rallies. So the government want to crack down the demonstrators. So they arrested the people there and even shoot the protesters. They tried, they cut off the internet as well. But on the other side, the protester, they want to, against the military government. They put a lot of pressures on social medias and to these companies and also the ordinary peoples, try to convince them and also to push them away from work. They asked them to join the protest and also want them to put aside the work. So that's what happened in Myanmar. And also you can imagine this brings also gives a huge impact on the supply chain. Not only the logistic facilities, but also on the manufacturing, because of these workers, these laborers, and has been given the pressures by the social media, by their friends, by their relatives, and to ask them to stop work and join the protest. Next slide, please. Next, thank you. So actually for Maersk, some of our customers actually they do have their factories in Myanmar. So how Maersk helps them to mitigate the supply chain impacts there. So the first thing I would say, always being prepared. So for the Myanmar situation, like what I described, actually you can see that there's a huge disruptions to the supply chain and also to the logistic facilities as well. So what we have done is we actually prepare the business continuity plans in advance. And also we identify what could be the backup measures for not only our warehouses, but also for our office operation. So even in case of, for examples, like the internet cut off or these electricity supply cut off, so we did have the alternative plan to activate the team outside of the country even to support the operations. And also our employees need to be well trained, and also they should be prepared for the potential disruptions like the internet outrage. They need to understand what they should do in case of this happens, and also need to understand how they can support customers, ensure the operation continuity. And the second thing is about the responses. We always need to make sure that no matter what happens, you have the quick responses to the new situations. So the first thing is about the crisis management team. As what I described, actually the protest, the military coup started on February 1st. But actually, 1 week before February 1st, we have already received some internal risk alert and showing that the risk of potential protest there is was increasing. So also during that weekend, we actually already keep a close monitoring of the Myanmar situations. So even we didn't know that how and when this event will, these kind of protests will impact our business or impact the countries. But at least we keep a close an eye. We keep an eye on the situations. So when the things happen on the February 1st, at least for our team, our crisis management team can activate immediately. There's no delay in the incident reporting and also the escalation process internally. And the second part is, and also the situations in Myanmar actually develop pretty fast, especially for the first 3 months. So it's a keeping change all the time. At the beginnings, and actually the military government also want to quickly crack down the protest. They cut off the internet, and also they impose the curfew there. And but later, actually, the situations deteriorated. Also, the protesters they want to fight against the military government. Also, to very active on the social media, all these things. So what we have done is also at the local level, you need to also establish the mechanism to monitor the risk, and especially for our office and the warehouse, we do have the physical locations in Myanmar, in Yangon. So it's very important that before you have your employees or coming to the office or coming to the site to continue the services, you also need to make sure that it's safe to do so. So we did work with some security, the professional external security intelligence companies to monitor the risk. They actually help us to provide the first-hand security risk informations and help us also to monitor uh, for example, so where could be the high risk areas where the shootings happens, just also to ensure that our employees are safe to perform their job there. And the third thing is about the customer engagement guideline that we develop to support our team to have the dialogue with our customer about the situations and actions. Basically, for that guideline, it covers the latest development. And also, we map out what could be the risk to the supply chain, what are the key dependency to their supply chain there. And also, we give some suggestions on the contingency planning for different scenarios. From customer perspective, they also they actually you can imagine, so they have their logistic service provider to monitor the situations, keep them informed of the latest development on a daily basis, and also we did arrange the the separate meetings with the different with customers to discuss the short-term and long-term outlook, and also to give us suggestions to customers on some customized solutions, and also to give them updates on their vendor management there. A lot of customers, as I mentioned earlier, so they have the factories in Myanmar, but actually they don't necessarily have their direct office in Myanmar. So which also means that they heavily rely on their logistic service suppliers, or let's say the supply chain service supplier, to keep them updated of the factory situations, of the vendor situations. So that's also what we did during the situations to provide the better support to our customers. And actually, these meetings usually it's quite interesting. It's not engage the supply chain team or sourcing team only at the customer side, but also usually customers will engage even the corporate social responsibility team to work together with us. It's more like a joint disruptions handling team to deal with the situations together. So I would say for these specific cases, if you can see that if the disruptions hit the supply chain, I think it's a very good is if you can work with your logistic suppliers and a vendor together to deal with the situations. That actually will make your disruptions responses more effective and also more efficient. Next slide. Thank you. So this is a very brief sharing about these two cases. As I mentioned, in case of a disruption happens, actually, I hope that these two brief cases also give you some inspirations on how a company could react, and also what could be the structures to prepare and manage these disruptions. So this is also my last slide. I want to quickly sum up of the three key takeaways for the disruptions handling. The first thing is about the risk monitoring. So as the case I share in the Myanmar situations, it's very important to establish the mechanism to monitor the risk. This will allow you to get early warnings and also some signals, and so you can respond or react faster or even earlier compared to your competitors. So it's very important. And second thing is about the plan B. So always have an alternative plan in case, for example, sourcing or from one country is disrupted. You need to know that what are other options that you can have to keep your manufacturers running, to keep your cargoes, to keep your products always on shelf. So this is very important. So in my views, and managing disruptions is sometimes it's like a card game, I call it. So you don't know how exactly the event could disrupt, could impact your business, but at least you know that what the cards that you can play against with the situations. So that's to me is very important to have a plan B in advance. The last point is about the collaboration. This is the key to resilience. You need to collaborate internally with your different departments, like your sourcing team, manufacturing team, production, etc., and also externally with your vendors, with your logistic companies, suppliers. Together, you can actually manage the disruptions in a more effective and efficient way. Although the supply chain, I always also say to my customers and also my colleagues as well. So when the disruptions is, when the supply chain is disrupted, the solutions are not limited to the supply chain itself. It could the solutions could come from your sourcing or your marketing team, even to, for example, so they can even influence your customer demands, right? Or other solutions. So same in Maersk. Actually, if one transport mode is disrupted, then we can actually work with other departments, other products to work together to come up with the alternative solution. We call it with multiple layers of a safety net to our customers. That's what I see is how we can collaborate together to make the whole resilience manager in a more effective way. All in all, that the resilience, as the picture show here, is teamwork. So we are in the same boat. We share the work together to keep the boat moving forward efficiently. So that's my slides. My next slide, I think, is I also provide my contacts in the next slide. So in case of any questions, yes, thank you. You can drop me emails or connect me on LinkedIn. So this is about my presentation. Thank you very much. And next, I will hand over to Mr. Nick Wildgoose. He also have a vast experience of resilience, and he will also share his experience on the resilience part. So Nick, hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Zera, and thank you for those interesting insights, which I endorse fully. Those last 3 points there are key. And it's nice to be talking to all you members at the BCI again. I think I've been doing it for the last 15 years at least now, around this topic. That's what I specialize in, supply chain resilience. And one thing I'd mention in that respect, the rest of my CV you can look at in LinkedIn. I won't bore you with now because you'll probably fall asleep before I get to the end of it. I'm too old in that sense. But the BCI supply chain resilience study, which I'm the annual one that I was one of the founders of, is still going, and I think still provides valuable information and insights. And I'll touch on some aspects of it during my presentation. Okay, next slide, please, Kieran. Okay, so one of the points I'm going to make, and I have made for a while, is being reactive to these whole series of supply chain issues is not good enough. You need to start to be proactive if you aren't already. You're looking for the next issue to come along. And by the way, I wanted to start off with a, as I reflected on making this talk, I want to start off with a people story in the sense of it's occurred to me because I've turned grey and aged rapidly because of the fact every day I talk to people dealing with supply chain risk. And in the last 2 years, I have to say, it's been horrendous for those individuals and all of us involved, because it's been one thing after another. And it's almost, well, it is weekly at least, if not daily. I mean, just picking up on the last kind of few days, you've now got the Ukraine crisis leading to gas being potentially cut off with Poland and Bulgaria. You've got the ongoing China lockdown out of COVID and so on. You've got potential further sanctions coming in. I mean, there's so many things that can impact your supply chain. So one of the things I would urge you to do in the Business Continuity Institute community is to look to reach out to the individuals in your teams who are responsible in one way or another. I know that could be you as well, to think about how resilient they are as individuals. I know this is a bit non-theoretical and non-PowerPoint, but I think it's pretty stressful out there. And to carry this on for 2 years, you need to make sure the individual resilience is up there, because it's the people who are making these changes happen, such as the collaboration and so on. So think about yourself and think about those individuals. I don't normally put that in my presentations, but I think it's very important, particularly at this stage, because as I'll cover later, I'm afraid these issues are not going away, unfortunately, a whole series of them. But coming back then to my first slide on climate risk, and I wanted to cover something that isn't so well covered, in my opinion, in the international news. Obviously, we talk about climate risk, but I think a lot of us think, oh, well, that's 2030, net zero 2050. But no, let me tell you, behind all these other news stories, it is happening now. You cannot afford to wait and think about a lot of the steps you're taking, hopefully, and we'll talk about this more later, to make yourself more resilient will help you with climate risk. But don't think it's not there already. And I wanted to illustrate this with a few facts on this slide. So if you hadn't heard, and I'll be honest, until recent months, I hadn't heard either, but Santiago now has water rationing. The reservoir, after 13 years of drought, the main reservoir for Santiago, the capital of Chile, and where around half of the population live, is at 5% of its proper level, 5%. So they are rationing water in Santiago. in the area. And imagine what that does to the industry. And by the way, that could impact on $175 billion of Chilean output. And most importantly for my audience, to bring this to your attention, I'm sure you like Chilean wine and Chilean grapes. If you don't, then please try it. But it could be a rare commodity going forward. So yeah, I hope take that seriously. And if you think it's just happening in Chile, look at and this is taken from the Aon recent climate change exposure, my second bullet here. The economic impacts of climate disruption last year was $329 billion. $329 billion. That's a lot of money in anybody's terms. And for the first time, 4 events exceeded $20 billion. You cannot ignore climate change. And even if you and your organizations are hoping to hope it'll go away, and frankly, you're just too busy with Ukraine, COVID, bear in mind, and this is the next development, and I was at a conference where a lot of legal lawyers were talking about this last week. There are an increasing number of legal cases from non-government organizations, even potentially getting into class actions in the States, taking on corporates for their inactivity about climate risk. And one of the things, I don't like predicting the future. I wish I could. I wouldn't be working now if I could have done. But what I will say is that I do confidently predict there will be more legal cases against corporates. So if you think you can just wait for something to happen, it's going to be very costly. Okay, that's we might get on to climate risk again later, but let's move on to things that are more in the news. But if you could go on to the next slide, Kieran, thanks. So yeah, I'm sad to say 2 years on, and twice for me, COVID so far, despite all the injections, and it's still not pleasant, I have to say. It continues. We see, and Maersk can know about this, freight rates and port disruptions are still significant, and in fact, freight rates in some areas I think they're at double. Zera can tell me exactly what it is, but I think when you look back at some rates, are about double. So there's that big part of the cost inflation aspects, but also we know that China lockdowns continue, given their kind of zero tolerance approach of COVID. And by the way, it's not just those regions that that are being shut down. Very important to realize is the transport links between the different provinces in China are also being closed down. So even today, those supply chain disruptions are continuing, as well as you getting local COVID issues around the world. So as BCI teams, what are some of the lessons that we can learn out of COVID? And by the way, this could apply to a number of other areas. I think one of the things I reflect on is how people segmented their suppliers. In other words, they had their strategic suppliers down as, key direct material suppliers. Maybe it was the semiconductor chips that they couldn't get their product out without those. But very few of them, well, I think almost none of us had things like personal protective equipment or other elements like that. In fact, we normally gave that. I was an ex-head of procurement. That I would give to my most junior buyer to cut their teeth on, to say, see how cheap you can get us our protective equipment for in the manufacturing plant. And clearly that meant that, there was limited stock. The relationships, going back to what Zera said, were in terms of collaboration with those suppliers were very poor. And suddenly it became a strategic commodity. So one of the things I would urge you to do is re-look at how you're assessing your suppliers from a risk point of view and who really are the strategic suppliers in these changing terms. And also there's a lot of talk about the end of globalization is nigh. I have some doubts about how quickly that will happen for a start and whether it will ever happen, but there's no doubt there will be some more nearshoring. And what you need to do as business continuity teams is to ensure when there is more nearshoring that people realize that doesn't mean you don't need a business continuity plan. There still is a risk. It's a different risk, but just because you're sourcing from Tunisia and not China doesn't mean there isn't a whole set of new risks that you need to be aware of. And most importantly, And thanks to the BCI, and I will praise the BCI, going back now probably 12 years ago, you can't say as an audience you weren't warned about multi-tier issues, because I remember being involved in that report, I think in 2010, so 12 years ago, where we've discovered that, and I think it was one of the first times it had been publicized, that around 40% of the disruptions for the big corporate supply chains we were looking at was from below tier 1. So this is not new news. I'm pleased now, by the way, 12 years on, that one of the things I do is work with a lot of software companies and technology companies, AI and machine learning, all this good stuff. And we are starting to be able to help corporates understand their sub-tier exposures. But I'm not here to go through a whole raft of those today. But just to say that multi-tier mapping, I'll come on to it again, is critical in these difficult times. Kieran, could you move on to the next slide, please? And then, you know, to bring us up to date, the Ukraine, the sad Ukraine conflict, which is a terrible thing to have happened. But I'm only asked to talk about the supply chain things here. Clearly, we've got, and this is well known about oil and gas, I think, and I just talked about Poland and Bulgaria and the ongoing battles there. But I don't think many of us knew that 80% of the sunflower oil comes from those regions as well. So cooking oil is going to be a problem. And we already know that the semiconductor had a 2-year waiting list by and large. It might just about start to come down. There's a long lead time, by the way, on building semiconductor fabs and so on. But now we've got the issue of neon gas, where around 90% of it, of the relevant grade, at least to the US, comes from the Ukraine. So they have yet another problem to deal with. And that's part of the issue I think we have with these interconnected risks. When I look at for example, the next 2 bullets I've got down here, corn and wheat, they're closely related, by the way. We already had a wheat problem, if you didn't know. Sorry to be such a bringer of bad news on this webinar, but the price had, there were difficult harvests in Canada and US, so the price had shot up. And now we've got 2 of the largest exporters in the world, you know, probably not being able to export this year for a variety of reasons. So food prices go up, and bringing out that interconnection of risk, that means, by the way, in my opinion, a much heightened geopolitical risk. Because if food prices are high, that is a large contributor to potential geopolitical unrest. For example, the Syrian conflict, what people widely believe was because of poor harvest for a number of years in areas of Syria, which created disruption among the people. And you know, a lot of this wheat goes to developing countries and so on. It's going to be more expensive or whatever. So there's a challenge there. And I thought, just to illustrate the uncertainty, and I quite often quote this gentleman, the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink. And why do I do that? He doesn't give me any commission, unfortunately, for doing it. But frankly, he's got $7 trillion of assets. It may be a few more under his management. So I think it's worth listening to what he says for a number of reasons. So one of the comments he made in his latest letter, so this is very recent, he said, and talking about the Ukraine war, he says the ramifications of this war are not limited to Eastern Europe. They are layered on top of a pandemic that has already had profound effects on political, economic, and social trends. The impact will reverberate for decades to come in ways we cannot predict. So I think we all face a great deal of uncertainty across our supply chains, and we need to take account of that. Next slide, please, Kieran. So in a similar way to Zera, I just want to end with 3 actions I think are important that you as BCI professionals can help make happen, supporting your supply chain colleagues and advising your senior execs. One is about driving this multi-tier understanding, so you're not constantly surprised by issues coming from below the tier 1, particularly around your critical supply chains. You're going to need to do that for climate change anyway, because for many of you out there, 80 to 90% of your carbon footprint is in your supply chain. So if you don't start to tackle that, then you're going to get nowhere near net zero. And frankly, we have no planet left if we don't do that in the next 50 years or so. There's now technology, my second point, around being able to model your supply chains using a digital twin and looking at scenarios. And I think that's a very useful way of saying, you know, the what ifs. So what if we lost output out of our Chinese suppliers for a month, or the Suez Canal closed down as Zera went through it, and so on. And finally, as well, I know a number of my, if I call them colleagues in supply chain resilience, have struggled recently in terms of understanding, because their risk tools have assessed corporate ownership and so on at one level, but they haven't really looked at the individuals. So they've then been struggling to say, well, is this actually Russian owned, or are these Russian people that now we shouldn't be dealing with because the US has said we can't deal with these people? Or who really owns these? Who are the individuals? Are they, because the systems were only looking at the corporate side rather than the individual side, so they've been then scrambling around to say, have we got the data on this? So as sanctions, unfortunately, are not going to go away, in my opinion, for a while, I think, you know, there's an opportunity you need to think about, have you got assessment tools? Because they are there, but have you got the right tools in place on individuals? I hope that's been useful. Next slide, Kieran. There's my contact email, and I'm on LinkedIn if any of you want to carry on the conversation, and I'll hand over to Chris. Thank you for your attention. Chris, I think you're muted. We'll just wait. Chris is just trying to sort his audio out, I think.
There we go. How about now?
That's perfect, Chris. Back over to you. Technology. Who wants it? I've just been advocating it. I'll hand it back to you.
I'm in business continuity. I had a spare battery. So thank you and appreciate the time. I'm the Director of Customer Advocacy here at Infinite Blue. Here we provide BCM software and services worldwide to our global customers. And our flagship product is BC in the cloud. And I'm getting a low battery warning, so I'm going to multitask here. In my role, I assist global customers in expanding and maturing their BCM program. This puts my team in a unique position to observe, support, and participate in customer issues and challenges in BCM and supply chain. I'm dual certified in BCM and information security. I'm really passionate about this industry and raising positive awareness in the community and uplifting our customers and their companies. I'm also a regular on the speaking circuit, and this industry and others. I teach cybersecurity and risk in the graduate program at Penn State University. So without further ado, and again, I take on a different approach here. So where we see it is the early approach to BCM, that is in the slight delays, where we're seeing customers that are seeing, you know, they're not used to the customer saying, or the vendor or supplier saying, hey, we're missing this. Can you help us out, or we'll get it there. Slightly missed shipments. So yeah, it'll be here in a day. That day turns into weeks. And an early warning sign is also the vendor goes dark or is no longer responsive. And where we see it starting for you is through starting earlier. Hey, let's leverage obviously our BIA for finding those vital vendors. Making sure that we know through our third-party assessment team or directly from the business unit that, hey, they're a single source, sole source, or the big ones, majority supplier. Let's look a little deeper, not just to them, but for those sole source or majority suppliers is let's look to fourth-party assessments. Where are they getting it from? Big one here, and we'll touch on it a little later, is looking at those vendors. Normally, you know, I see our customers, they're using machine intelligence, they're using NOAA and other services to track the hurricanes and the weather at their locations. They're now expanding that to vendors to find out and get proactive with the vendor to say, hey, this is what I see coming, what are you doing? Because our larger customers have the ability to have those tools in place where the vendors don't. And then it's like, what do we have for just in time? You know, Nick, to your point, a sunflower oil. Okay, we see this is coming forward. What can we do to increase our stockpile of it and then look for an alternative as well? So it's being much more proactive in that supply chain where we see potential risks. Next slide, please. So this is a build. I apologize if you want to just build it out. These are some things I wanted to share with you that are excellent sources of mitigating vendor risks. So the Santa Fe group has what's called the SIG and SIG Lite. Those are an excellent platform to send to your vendors that says, hey, what are you doing in these areas? I think the SIG is well over 350 questions, but they're broken down into physical security, risk, business continuity. There's a subscription involved with that one. It's relatively low when you consider what the costs are. And again, there's the cloud security assessments. Again, more focusing on the cyber piece of it, but again, a good piece. I think standard is SOC 2 or an ISO certification. But regardless of what you're looking to get from your vendors, is to make sure you get some of the artifacts, right? Show me your governance documents, show me your last tabletop exercise, making sure that you have everything that you need to feel comfortable about that third-party supplier to you. Next slide. So what I wanted to do is just to give you a section. This has got 3 builds, if you would. This is section K for business continuity under the SIG. And you can see here, it's extremely comprehensive. There's also a SIG Lite. You may be actually on the recipient's end of it if you're a vendor or a supplier in that chain here. So you can see it covers everything from evaluation to testing. Next slide. Next slide, person. I did not put my contact information in, so I'll turn it back over for conversation.
Thank you all, and that was a really interesting conversation. Thank you for that. So we have had some questions come in. Actually moving on to this discussion segment of the presentation. Starting for this first one, it's quite a big one. What essential steps can improve resilience in a supply chain? And Nick, if you want to take that one.
Okay, thank you very much, Kieran, for that. I hope we've, if you've all been listening, you would have heard a number of points we made during the presentation from all 3 of us. So hopefully we've given you some guidance there. I think it also depends on where you're at in the maturity cycle, you know, from, because I'm aware the audience could be in a whole mixture of places. So I'll try and tackle a few of the key different places that might be, you might be at, as it were. But as I say, it depends, you know, if you're still at reactive stage of just dealing with each issue, you know, week by week or whatever it is, then you need to move to being more proactive. And I know in order to achieve that, what I always say to people, if you haven't got top management support, and believe me, I hope there's not too many top management teams that don't realize supply chain resilience is important, whether they're in production industries or in service industries, by the way, because as Chris talked about, he talked about the cyber supply chain. And believe me, if you're increasingly using software as a service, as a service company or some kind of third-party IT vendor, and if they go out, you know, if they're not around and your desktops don't work, you don't have much of a service business, I would say. So bear in mind, it's across all industry sectors, this need for resilience in supply chains. So, you know, make sure that top management are bought in, there's never waste a crisis is a very overquoted phrase, but I've just done it again to add to that, a good crisis, as it were. And I think this is your opportunity there to get more investment resource, because I think in general there's more needed in resilience. I think corporates haven't given it enough value add, as it were. And as I pointed out, and I'll just make one illustration here before I hand across to my colleagues, that multi-tier mapping that I said I believe is critical, particularly around key commodities. As I say, the payoff is not just in terms of improving your supply chain resilience by hopefully being a step ahead of certain disruptions or understanding that, goodness, have we really got all of our suppliers of this commodity in Thailand? We never realized it's at tier 2. Perhaps that isn't such a clever idea. But there's also the climate risk now issue that means you need to have that transparency. So the board or the exec team should be looking at the business case with both of those benefits, not you going from your silo as business continuity, working with the resilience team and forgetting about the CSR team. So I hope that's answered your question, Kieran, at one level, and I'm sure Chris and Zera will potentially add some other pieces. I'll hand across to them if they've got anything to add.
Sure, I'll jump in. Sorry, Zera.
No, it's
Is one of the crucial steps I see our customers in improving their resilience is looking at their supply chain more so as a partnership. I kind of touched on it, but it's letting them, where we have the tools that they don't, in weather and civil unrest and things of that nature, is letting the vendors or their suppliers know, hey, this is happening, and taking a much more proactive approach, and instead of assuming that they're dealing with it or they know of it. That also goes to strengthening the relationship and talking about in advance, what will you do instead of calling a force majeure for climate. I saw that happen quite a bit. We had that cold weather here in Texas, that cold snap, and a lot of the suppliers for our manufacturing and distribution customers declared force majeure, which was well within their rights. But having proactive identified, hey, okay, you're my majority supplier, we have this cold weather coming in, what are we doing as an alternative, whether we put the orders in advance or we're looking to our secondary supplier. It's taking that partnership approach where we normally never would even think of it.
Thank you, Christian. I think it's a very valid point. And also maybe I can share a little bit on that part from Maersk perspective, because also Maersk is known as logistics supplies, right? We work closely with different customers from different industries and on the resilience in the past few years. Actually, in Maersk last year, we have developed the supply chain resilience module together one of our big customers. And the whole process is starting from the supply chain mapping. Also, this, and I remember, Nick, in your presentation, you also elaborated that for suppliers chain, actually also it's important to also have a better understanding about your tiers of a supplier. That's also better to control your risk. So to me, it's also quite important. So the first step is a supply chain mapping to understand better what your whole supply chain looks like and who involved in the supply chain. The second part is like what Christian just talked about identify the risks. And also not just limited to the risk identifications, but also to understand what is acceptable to you. Like Christian mentioned, that you should understand that what's the risk acceptance to use, and not only from the legal perspective, but also for your business and perspective, that what is acceptable. And the third thing is ongoing surveillance. I think this is also about how, once we know that what could disrupt your business and what could be the risk, then actually the next you should establish the mechanism to monitor what's going on. And based on these risk things, also we have to think about what could be the contingency planning. What's the plan B, right? And after that, also we need, in case something happens, like the crisis and happens, like a COVID or Suez Canal, whatever, then how your organizations could respond to that, and also how your organizations and what's the structures in your organization to support this disruption handling. This is also important and critical to ensure that you always have an efficient response to the situations. And the last point is, and I would say it's also you need to establish the performance and measurement. So once you're doing these and all these steps, you also need to have a better understanding about whether you did a good job in the disruption handling, or there's some areas that can be improved. To me, it's also important always to have a lessons learned after a crisis is finished. This is also to keep you continuous in improvement. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you for that. So moving on to the next one, we've got here, how can an organization avoid being driven to a single point of failure in their supply chain? Chris, if you'd like to have a look at that one.
Sure, why not? Thank you. That's a great question. I kind of touched on it, and I think you've heard there, and Nick touched on it as well. It's going down and doing that deeper dive and finding out through your third-party risk team, if you do have those single or sole source providers, and going down into the majority provider, and then making sure that they have that resiliency within themselves. And I like taking it down for those three labeled suppliers, is to go down to the fourth level. Who is their majority supplier? Who have they outsourced to as well to ensure of that? And that includes cyber as well, because that seems to be hitting that pretty hard. So I think that's really what's happening, and where I see customers taking that focus, they're expanding their resiliency. Yeah, Zera, you're shaking your head, so I know I'm on the right track.
No, I fully agree with what you're saying. So I think that's important, especially for, like you mentioned, for customer to understand where's their single point of a failure, right? What could be the dependency for their supply chain? And also on this one, and also I'm just thinking that if your suppliers, because of people, when you and for taking Maersk as an example, as I mentioned in my presentation, so to many of Maersk customers, actually Maersk is one of their largest logistic service supplier. So also I'm thinking that if for some services that you heavily rely on your service suppliers or one service supplier, you like Chris just mentioned that you have to make sure that the supplier you work with is reliable, and also they can support you in case of something happen. That's very important. And if that's not the cases, also you can think about, okay, what are other options that you can take to mitigate the impact. Like I know that for some, especially that's quite frequently happen in the supply, that for example, like have a multiple suppliers, or even have like a nearshoring, and that also to reduce the risk and on the single point of a failure. So this you can have a different strategies on this to mitigate the overall risk of a supply chain.
Yeah, I've only got, thank you. I've only got a couple of points to add in there, which I think are useful. And if we didn't bring out enough, by the way, it's probably brought out, but how do you focus? Because it's a journey of improvement. So you need to focus your efforts in looking at this, I would say, from a disruption point of view, on those areas that would have the biggest business impact. Because it's a journey of improvement. You might have 100 even 100 suppliers, to go down, direct suppliers, go down to the tiers takes a lot of effort. So, it's a journey of improvement, I would say. You can't do this overnight, but your most important, say 10 suppliers, that's where you do your, looking at where the single point of failure might be, because they're probably Pareto 80% your profitability. So that might be a useful point. And equally as well, in product design, I think it's quite a key thing in manufacturing, that supply chains are considered even in the product design, because you do not want to be designing a product, I would suggest, while you're designing it for a sole source supplier effectively. And then you know, if you can avoid it, you want to try and keep that flexibility and agility in your supply chain and design. Hopefully they're useful extra points. Back to you, Kieran.
Brilliant, that was useful, thank you. So looking at this next one, I think we touched on this in the presentations again, but the pandemic, we're still seeing impact from the pandemic on the global supply chain, and it's still causing significant disruption. What elements are we seeing having a prolonged effect on the supply chain, and how can we manage this evolving risk? Zera, would you like to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kieran. Actually, this year is the third year of COVID. And like you said, we are still under the shadow of it. And also we see the port congestions in US and also in Europe now. And also in China, we're still facing the lockdowns that hugely disrupted the entire supply chain and the distribution out of China, right? The Shanghai has been, I think Shanghai has been under strict lockdown since early April. So till now, it's almost a month. And also this is not only impact the logistics side, but also give a huge impact on the manufacturing and a lot of factories near Shanghai, especially the automotive part. A lot of suppliers near Shanghai and in Shanghai has been impacted. I remember there's some studies and that more than 1,000 automotive suppliers and that actually located in these areas and also facing the impact. So this is what we see actually the impact of the pandemics. And also, I think that the better ways, actually, I think both Nick and also Chris already mentioned in their presentation, as well as mine as well. It's very important that you should have you should have a program on resilience. You need to identify the risk, have the mechanism to monitor the risk in advance, and also you have to have these contingent planning things to mitigate the risk in general. This is my advice on how in general can reduce or manage the risks. Nick, in your presentation, also I remember you mentioned especially the Shanghai lockdowns and also impacts the links to different provinces, right? Maybe you can elaborate a bit more on your views of impact and how we can mitigate the risks in general.
Okay, well, thank you, Zera. I don't think I've got much more to add than I put in the presentation, really, but I think it's just that awareness that just because in China an area is beginning to open up, you also need to be careful to ensure that the transport routes between, you know, the Chinese government's allowing them to take place, because without the movement of goods, you still don't have an operating supply chain in many cases. So certainly they can turn to Maersk, can't they, to help with deeper insights on that better than me in that sense in terms of intelligence. So I haven't got much more to add on this. But Chris, have you got anything more to add on this particular question?
Sure, absolutely. You know, here in the U.S., we're calling it the mass resignation. So we're seeing both internal direct in our customers, and the supply chain is they're stopping. Truckers, there's a huge shortage of truck drivers here. And so where I mean, our regulating bodies such as the FFIEC for banking are looking at it, and we're taking that even further in the post-pandemic is who are my skilled resource? Not the job title that's doing the process, but instead, who are the skilled people? How long have they been here? What's their institutional knowledge? So we're looking at it from a company perspective in organizational resiliency. And then that, again, is being shared down to their third-party suppliers is, hey, this is some of the work that we're doing here, and making that suggesting down, more so towards that partnership than a true B2B approach.
Great, thank you. So moving on again, I know, Nick, you touched on this in your presentation, but when we look at the lessons that can be learned to current events, not just a pandemic, but such as the war in Ukraine as well, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, you say, Kieran, I covered a lot off already, but I think my other observation will be that, and it goes back to the climate risk point really, all businesses out there, in order to move towards those net zero targets, are going to have to review their whole supply chain, their whole business model. And if you think about it, Ukraine in the short term is making us assess our business models and our supply chains because of, short-term issues. I would just urge companies to try and think about that, and the business continuity professionals on this, to encourage people to be more holistic about it and don't just deal with the short-term Ukraine issue, but consider resilience against all of these factors in the plans that Zera and Chris, we've kind of elaborated on already. But bring those initiatives together for top management. Don't let them exist, as I find too often, I'm afraid to say, in silos, functional silos within corporates, or with their own little initiatives. We can't afford that anymore, in my opinion. Very expensive way to do things. I'll hand back to Chris and Sarah in case they've got some other observations. I don't know who wants to go first. Chris, do you want to go first?
Oh, sure, why not? And I think it goes back to taking a look at what are the downstream implications, right? So, and you both have touched on it, trade routes and the supply chain implications from the Ukraine and the surrounding areas. So that, if I'm moving product through the Black Sea, I now expect a large amount of, right, Sarah? A large amount of delays or rerouting to avoid the conflict area, where it's not direct, it's an indirect impact that's going to delay me. Zera, I know that one hit home with you.
Thank you, Chris. You're absolutely right. Actually, when it happens and on day one, and actually the first things also we need to do is to evaluate how many vessels we do have in the Black Sea. So you're absolutely right. And actually, for these Ukraine situations, I would say that, to be honest, I don't think anyone has predicted in advance, right? So also, I think that's a kind of a challenge to every, I would say, supply chain resilience or resilience professionals on how we can ensure helping the organization to be prepared for the unexpected one. For the risk, we already know that we probably have a better ideas or understanding about what could be the risk to the organization, how these things could impact. But for the unexpected one, how exactly we need to be prepared in advance, and also how we can support the organization to manage the disruptions. I think that's also quite important, and also maybe we should cover, after the Ukraine situations, and that we should cover it in the internal discussion as well. Whether the organization, you do have the rights and structures to support your crisis handling, even for the unexpected one. And also, do you have all the necessary planning things, or let's say plan B, to help the organization mitigate the impacts? And also whether you have the risk mechanism to help you monitor the risk, and also to keep you receive these early warnings and when it's a hits to you. So I think maybe that could be the 3 points, and that for any organization to think about after these things.
Brilliant, thank you. And another big risk. What do we think about the implications of climate change from a supply chain perspective? I don't know if you want to start us up on that one, Chris.
Sure, be happy to. So when looking at climate change, and again, there's a great book on risk called by Michelle Wucker called The Gray Rhino. It's a great read about risks that are right in front of us and they're slow moving, but by the time they hit us, it's too late. Great website, by the way. And this is where that we're seeing the climate change. I'll give you a great real life example. We have a customer and their majority supplier is in California, and their process involves 750,000 liters of water a day. Yes, exactly. And so what we ended up working with them is identifying we not only do we have the climate change issue, but you have protesters, and we're having the water shortage, and the supplier was unaware. So it was enforcing that supplier to invest in water filtration system if they wanted to continue to do business with them. So it's a great example of, again, extending past there, a little out of the box, but a long-term effect is, hey, I've got protesters here and we're going through large amounts of water and it's our majority supplier. Because the cost to switch, it's not like flipping a light switch and rerouting shipping or trucking traffic or to another vendor. Onboarding new suppliers takes, in some cases, 8 to 12 months. So it's got to work with what I've got and then come up with a plan. So it's, again, being much more aware of past my own four walls of my building, especially on the climate change. Sarah, Nick?
Yeah, I can be the next. And I think that's like Nick mentioned in the presentation. In general, logistics supply, I think this should take I will also say that they need to take a bigger responsibility for their general emission cutoff, because logistic in general is I would say contributed to a lot of especially the carbon emissions globally. So also Maersk as a logistic service suppliers, I think it's important that we take actions to really to cut off the emissions or reduce the emissions as much as possible. For example, so you can introduce the new technology to move your cargoes in a more in a greener way. I know that for Maersk, in the past, most vessels actually use a lot of oils, right? And also they have a lot of waters to keep a balance of the vessels, all these things. And the new technologies, such as could be for example, like methanol to help in the vessel movement to reduce the emissions in general. That could also, it's not just about the logistic company in general should be take their corporate social responsibility, but also it helps our customers to also to fulfill their responsibility to the biggest society and also to their end customers as well. So I think in general everyone's in the world should be take a responsibility to contribute our in the energy savings and also to live in a more green life. Nick, maybe you can share more about this.
Just briefly, I'm conscious of time here as well, and the webinar length we're going on, which is great because we're all enthusiastic. But I'll just say on this one, I mean, people migration that's likely to come out of climate risk is something you should ignore and consider. And but bear in mind as well that the technology and data now available enables you to start running scenarios against some of your climate risks. So, and quite cost effectively, by the way, that's the other important thing. So if you're not doing it, why aren't you doing it? Because your board should be aware of this, and they're already talking about climate risk. Well, if they're saying it's an important risk in their annual reports, why aren't they going the next stage to actually try and pinpoint that? It won't be a perfect thing, but that's the thing about scenarios. At least it makes you think about things and look at things differently. Over back to you, Kieran.
Thank you. Just to wrap things up with, I think an important point we've touched on during this session is the importance of using these lessons learned and preparing for future events when they happen again, because they more than likely will happen again. Does anyone here have any final comments on that, just to finish things up?
I would say it's never too late to start.
Yeah,
I like that one.
yeah. Building off Chris, if you haven't started, then the start, I suppose, is the point about that. And as I said earlier, and it's something I go back to, I've reflected on this for a lot of years, it's a journey, of course. And that journey may meander a bit, but, you know, as Chris says, don't use that as an excuse to not start the journey, because I think we all realise that your companies compete in terms of supply chains. It's increasingly evident. It should be obvious, but in that case, they need to be resilient. And those that don't adapt, I'm afraid, like the species who don't exist on the planet anymore, you won't be around. Sorry to be. But those who do well, by the way, let's say on an optimistic note, will thrive. I would have done a positive rather than negative. I'll stop at that point unless there is that.
I just have one thing is remember collaborations. That's the ways and that you can improve your supply chain resilience. And also, I think that's the key to your supply chain resilience.
Absolutely.
Perfect. On that note, then, thank you very much for all of your expertise. Thank you, Zera. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
I'll see you on a future session.
Thank you, Kieran. Thank you.
Thanks
Bye.
very much. Bye.